Tonight we have the privilege of having Mnar Muhawesh, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. She is also a regular speaker on responsible journalism, sexism, neoconservatism within the media and journalism startups. She is also regularly interviewed on nationally and internationally syndicated networks like RT about the need for independent journalism and non-conservatism in the media. She started her career as an independent multimedia journalist covering Midwest and national politics while focusing on civil liberties and social justice issues, posting her reporting and exclusive interviews on her blog Mint Press, which she later turned Mint Press into a global news source that it is today. In 2009, she also became the first American woman to wear the hijab to anchor and report news in an American media station. She is also a wife and mother of a rascal 4-year-old boy, so she's juggling her duties as a CEO and motherly tasks and successful as a super mom. So, without further ado, I'd like you all to welcome Mnar.
Thank you very much. How convenient. So first, can we do a mic check? Are we okay?
I'll check that.
I'm a lot shorter than I thought. Really, I didn't know it was going to be this tall. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be here. And I'm especially honored and humbled to be invited by a group of people that work in community and journalism news, and you try to intersect the two. Because I understand that community news and its existence in general is being threatened by net neutrality and by takeover of the corporate media. So I'm excited to hopefully shed some light on re-empowering our local communities through independent journalism and an interesting concept that I came to quite literally live by, which is called glocal. And would like to shed light on how it's essential for journalism. What glocal means is to think globally and act locally. In a world that seems so vast and large and sometimes very scary and very different than what we are here today, we are actually interconnected, and our everyday decisions do impact people around the world, and what people do around the world actually impact us here. Now, to sum up the concept of glocal, the more informed and empathetic we are on a local level, the more peace we can see around the world. Now, speaking of local, I'm actually from Maple Grove, Minnesota, and now I live in Plymouth, which is not so global, but it was really interesting growing up in Maple Grove because I'm a first-generation American. My parents are originally from Jerusalem. They're Palestinian, who migrated here in the late 1970s to do what most immigrants do. They wanted to live the American dream. Now, growing up in the United States, I actually didn't know much about my culture, about their heritage and their religion. And because of that, they decided to move the whole family, all 4 kids and them, to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. Now, I was young. I was just a kid. I was 9 years old. I didn't speak a word of Arabic and had no idea how this move would eventually change my life forever and impact my decisions as an adult, as well as help my perception on how media works. Well, we moved to Jerusalem. We assimilated. I got to meet my parents' family, make new friends, visit historic and tourist holy sites, Christian churches, Muslim mosques, Jewish temples. The people and geography were a sight to remember. The skies were always clear, the sun always shining. Everybody you meet has a big, bright smile on their face and invites you in for a meal and some tea. But all these details aside, it was very hard not to notice, even at 9 years old, that we had just moved into apartheid and a semi-war zone under colonial occupation. The first year we lived in Jerusalem, things were a bit calm politically, but soon into the second and third years, the Palestinian uprising had erupted. By the time I was 10, I had already witnessed human rights abuses by a state that had convinced the world that it was a democracy. I had witnessed Palestinians being subjected to discriminatory laws, having their travel controlled, their land stolen, living behind a 30-foot-high concrete wall that was an apartheid wall that was being presented to the world as a security fence. Every single day was a matter of survival and living under this martial law and military occupation. I was surrounded with thoughts of children being killed by bombs, families left homeless from airstrikes, electricity and water cut off regularly, and entire cities having their water poisoned by settlers. Men and young boys were regularly abducted by police in the middle of the night raids and being held in indefinite detention without trial and no charge. I would cross through checkpoints where the taxi driver would yell "duck" because Israeli soldiers would be shooting rubber bullets and live ammunition at young children who were throwing rocks at them because they were being blocked and essentially denied an education. I would go to school at 6th and 7th grade with nearly half of the seats in my classroom empty because the rest of those kids were blocked from crossing those same armed checkpoints. Soldiers pointing guns at citizens roamed the streets, and Israeli settlers would kidnap children regularly and planted bombs at Palestinian elementary schools was common. I was traumatized, to say the least. And I didn't come here to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict because I'm sure you guys all know it's a really heated subject that's really complex, takes a lot of historical context to really understand. It's very emotionally charged. But let's be honest here. The media has done a horrible job at covering this subject accurately. What the media has done for this conflict, however, is broken it down in a language that they're so good at. It's a religious war. Muslim versus Jew. They hate each other. Why should we get involved? What the media, and how they describe Palestinians specifically are Muslim militants who want to kill all Jews and annihilate the state of Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, using the pretext of the Holocaust to increase sentiment. Now, when I personally described to you the conflict, I didn't even bring up religion. I brought up to you a personal experience that I saw with my own eyes. And I didn't even mention religion once. I described the reality of the ground of fascism, living under a police state, inequality, and most obvious, apartheid and war, a perspective you rarely hear of. But I wanted to share my personal experience with you, and I'm actually shaking because I always get a little anxiety when I start speaking about it. Because little did I know moving overseas, as a young child, would this experience shape not only my perspective on life, as I mentioned before, but how the media operates. We finally moved back to the US in 2001, just back to Maple Grove, life back to normal, and this was just a few months before September 11th. I was absolutely traumatized. I was suffering from what military service members suffer from when they return from Iraq, survivor's guilt. I had PTSD and anxiety. I was now living a comfortable life in Maple Grove, Minnesota, but I couldn't forget what I had left behind and the suffering I knew that people were still enduring back home. I was now 13. I felt like no one could understand what I had witnessed. Anytime I would bring it up, I would just break down into tears. And this is Maple Grove we're talking about, so you can just imagine. While most teenagers at this age are worried about football games, shopping, and partying, I turned to the media to stay up to date to the war that I couldn't let go. So I turned on the TV, got my Fox News, CNN, MSNBC on, and they would cover the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But what I got was images of Palestinian men covering their faces, looking very intimidating and scary, bearing arms. And the media would refer to Palestinians as militants, as Hamas was what they would call them. Never just regular people, the people that I saw, the person, me, when I was over there. The media instilled fear in the hearts and minds of everybody to help justify Israel's apartheid and fascist policies on a defenseless population. They painted this conflict, again, as a religious war because it's easier to blame religion than it is to say that this democracy that we've come to defend and this ally of ours that we fund and arm is actually a human rights abuser. Now, a few months later, the tragic day of 9/11 happened, and once again, the media was beating the drums of war and instilling fear into the hearts and minds of Americans to justify two wars, to bring freedom and democracy to a very uncivilized land, according to their narrative. The media encouraged the expansion of the war on terror and convinced us that they hate us for our freedoms. They are backwards, and they must be liberated. The media encouraged and even justified our country turning into a surveillance state and villainized over a quarter of the world's population who are Muslim because of the horrific acts of a few. Now, in the Iraq War alone, our war left over 500,000 civilians dead, and not many people know that. And that was in our attempt to liberate Iraq. And if we look at Iraq now, it's in a bigger mess than it was before. The country is suffering from sectarianism. Extremism is on the rise. Al-Qaeda has entered its borders. And once again, the Iraqi people are suffering the wrath of the results of Western interventionism, as U.S. airstrikes again are targeting ISIS in the north. Now, during this time, the media became the official mouthpiece for special interest groups like defense contractors who profit by the billions from war. It became the official mouthpiece for the U.S. government and its allies who wanted to occupy Iraq for its oil. Now, although I was only 13, it was obvious to me that the solution to these human rights crises could never be solved with the media behaving this way. If it wasn't just busy justifying military action and villainizing victims of war, the rest of our news coverage was purely for entertainment purposes, or what I like to call infotainment news. Through these experiences, and having lived through apartheid, having lived through a war, and having witnessed our media act as a lapdog to special interest groups, I pointed to the media as a source of the lack of solutions we have available to bringing peace, unity, and real justice into the world. And not to mention the personal attacks that came to my family because of September 11th. I blame the media for Americans' lack of understanding to these issues and the lack of empathy for the human casualty of our wars. When I was asked to speak today, I was especially excited to get the opportunity to be surrounded by people who really believe in community and in the concept of journalism that works in the interest of the public. You all believe, from what I understand, in building stronger communities by covering and sharing local stories that actually matter to those communities, that affect public policy and our everyday lives. This is what draws us all to working for our communities and in journalism in the first place, because what you're doing is an act of journalism. We believe that we're doing the public a favor by spreading truth and informing others. We pursue journalism and we work in journalism because we want to cover important stories that help make our communities stronger and action-driven. Now, as defined by our Constitution, the role of journalism in the United States is to act as a government watchdog and to work in the interest of the public and to hold those in power accountable so that the state can be prevented from abusing its power. Journalism, at its roots, is a public interest entity and is a form of activism. Now, I won't bore you with the philosophy of journalism because it gets intense, but it's important to understand why journalism is mentioned in our Constitution and why it's protected under our First Amendment rights, and why it's referred to as the fourth estate. It's supposed to hold the government and those that are in power in check. Because what I just described in defining journalism, unfortunately, is not the reality of the news media that we see practiced today. Instead, we are presented with infotainment, like I mentioned before. More Americans know, and I'm sure many of you guys know, more about Justin Bieber's DUIs over the summer, Kim Kardashian's baby, than they do know who we're at war with. And this is not you, but in general. Not surprisingly, over 70% of Americans actually, in a recent Gallup poll, showed that they actually don't trust the media. And just as a side note, I just stopped at Caribou Coffee right before I got here, and the young gentleman asked me, "What are you doing tonight?" And I'm giving a speech about corporate news, and he's like, I served 4 years in the military, and I don't trust the media at all. That's what he told me, and just a coincidence that I was speaking tonight. So it just goes to show that more people are losing trust in the corporate media. So when you think of news media, who do you think of? Do you have any answers?
Oh, yeah.
What do you got?
MSNBC, CNN, locally, Star Tribune.
Exactly.
Press, Hubbard Channel 5.
Exactly, and that's what comes to mind for me too. Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and all those local news channels. But these same media outlets are owned by the same 6 corporations that own all of American media. And this also trickles down to the local level. So we have an illusion of choice, right? And local news, now we talked about national news, but local news is a farce. Let's not mince with words here. It's an extension of this infotainment style news that the media analysts call distraction news, numbing down the brain news. We've got our top stories, two top stories, and the rest is mostly weather and sports. And the anchors have become celebrities. So what exactly went wrong, and how did we get here? And hopefully towards the end, when we reach questions, I hope that we can talk about solutions. In the early 1980s, and this is something that I research a lot, our media was owned by over 50 corporations. And within 20 years, by the year 2000, our media was consolidated to 6 media corporations. And that number continues to decline. The decline in honest media can be traced back to the 1990s, where we saw a mobilization in our economic system towards a move towards neoliberalism. This is where we saw a rise in crony capitalism, and it took the media right with it by defining success in American economy means to have a very cozy relationship with the government, which goes against all the tenets of journalism. Now, during this time, the FCC went from working as a public interest entity to a business structure that is owned by the very same corporations who are manufacturing our military weapons and contributing to globalization across the world. This also contributed to the rise of neoconservatism in the media, which means representing big business or acting as a PR firm for those who are in power. Now, this decline in truthful media actually created an epidemic, which was recently studied by many universities here in the US. This shifted the United States from the beacon of democracy that we thought we were to actually functioning into an oligarchy. This is what we've been fearing for so long. An oligarchy means the power of this country has shifted from the hands of the people into the hands of the few elite. Now, a recent study by Princeton, that's where the study came from, actually found that for the past 50 years or so, this shift from democratic ideals into government functioning as an oligarchy is directly related with the corporate media and its consolidation. Because now the media is not working in the interest of people, it's working in the interest of these elitists and these big corporations. So what's the solution? That's the question. I just gave you guys a lot of depressing news. So what's the solution? Well, there is some hope at the end of the tunnel because we're actually experiencing in what we call in the journalism world, we're living in a post-9/11 America. A lot happened since 9/11, and we all kind of live in this post-9/11 America. We use 9/11 as a reference point, correct? So since 9/11, we're actually just in the past 5 years, we're actually experiencing a renaissance, if you will, of independent journalists and independent media organizations like Mint Press, the one I founded, basically sprouting onto the surface to help fill that void in truth reporting that focuses more on the effects of imperialism, human rights, money and politics, and how these stories actually affect every single one of us. Now, as I mentioned before, over 70% of Americans, according to a recent Gallup poll, don't trust the media because it's so obvious who they're representing and working for, that there's a major thirst for this kind of news that Mint Press offers and others. In the independent media world, we found a common purpose in post-9/11 America in exposing how much special interest groups like the defense industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, big oil, and even foreign nations have influence on our media. That's why when you read independent journalism, you'll actually notice more coverage of the issues and relationships I just presented to you that bring Americans closer to the world we live in today. We're more interconnected than we thought. The biggest weapon any person has, and you all know this, and it's also feared by these same entities that I showed you, is education. I found courage and catharsis in pursuing journalism to speak up for those people around the world who are suffering because of imperialism and are being massacred in the name of power, money, and greed. I started Mint Press to fill in the void of coverage that has ignored social justice issues and human rights issues in hope more of us can come together in the cause of human rights and know that every life is precious. And that's how the concept of glocal came into my life. And now you all should ask yourselves, how are you bringing the world closer to you? Something else that I'm actually working on now is I'm building a foundation for independent journalism, which is called the Journalism Support Network. And the reason I'm building this foundation is because the biggest challenge we have in journalism and in media is funding. These major 6 corporations have a net worth of over $300 billion or $1 trillion in revenue a year, per year. That would be nice to have that much money because we'd be able to, have good independent journalism, but we don't have that kind of money. So my focus and my goal with this new network is to hopefully bring independent journalists and media together so that we can become stronger and a louder voice to help bring truth back into our media. Thank you. That was all.